This period from 1960 to 1990 can be divided into two sub-periods that are characterized by two very different approaches to the urban development of Aalborg. These sub-periods end and begin with certain breaks or events that change the approach to the development. In the first period, starting in 1950, the plans for the city were based on a very optimistic vision for the future. There was a great belief in progress and growth for the city. On the other hand, the city was in a great misshape. Many housing areas were worn down and could be characterized as slum. This called for a modernization of the old city center of Aalborg. The city center should function as the place for trade and shopping for the entire region of North Jutland. With big malls and pedestrian streets, the city center of Aalborg was to become the trade center for all of North Jutland. Due to the focus on the car, the accessibility and parking of the car was a primary objective in goal of achieving a new modern city growth. The overall structure for the urban development of Aalborg was focused on three topics that were interlinked: circulation street grid, a trade center in the city center, and sanitation of inadequate housing. The new circulation grid made the city center accessible from all sides and for people coming from far away. This also required a lot of parking spaces within the circulation grid, so the distance to trading and shopping areas was never far away. The trade center of the city center was made for pedestrians, with many pedestrian and shopping streets. These walking zones were steadily increasing during the period, where Gravensgade was the first in 1963, followed by Bispensgade in 1965, and finally Aalgade in 1972. At the same time, the big malls also started to pop up in the city center. The need for new roads, parking lots and malls meant that quite some space in the city center needed to be cleared. This was a good opportunity for removing and sanitizing many of inadequate and outdated houses and apartments in the city center. Later on, this clearing and sanitation of the city was seen as very brutal. In 1970, there was a great change in that all of the small municipalities in the country were put together in bigger municipalities. The second sub-period was from 1973 to 1990. After the modernization period that ended with the oil crisis in 1973, a whole new way of thinking a good city emerged. The previous period, where the car was predominant, was now seen as a very brutal planning period because of how big parts of the city was destroyed and torn down to make room for cars. The most significant symbol of the shift in planning became obvious with the cancellation of completing the Dag Hammarskjöldsgade a breakthrough. The new planning agenda was now to reconnect and preserve historical environments and restoring the housing that was in bad shape. Many of the backyards of the apartments were full of small sheds and worn down businesses. These had to be torn down, but the main houses would stay and be renovated. Since the expectation was still that Aalborg would grow and be the trade center of North Jutland, the old city center would need relief centers, new centers of retail outside the city, which could handle some of all the people coming to the city to do shopping. A big retail center south of the city, City South, was built. Outside of the city center, the accessibility by car was better, since the breakthroughs of the old city center were no longer an option. These relief centers would have a big impact of the development of the old city center and made it possible to focus on new approaches that rather met the needs of the pedestrians and low-pace users. In opposition to the previous period, it was no longer cars, but pedestrians and cyclists that were prioritized within the old city center. It meant working on to the quality of urban spaces with focus on cultural and historical environment and being aware of the negative weather effects. The ideals of planning had indeed changed, and the perception of the good city was definitely changed after the oil crisis. The oil crisis also had a big negative effect on the industries in Aalborg. Due to this crisis, the industry started to close down and move away. This was the starting point for the transition of Aalborg being a city of industry into a city of culture and knowledge. In summary, this sub-period, which was triggered by the oil crisis, the planning of the city changed character from a brutal modernization of the city to a carefully revitalization of the city's historical and cultural heritage. The city center was relieved from cars by creating new satellite relief centers in the periphery of the city. This meant that the focus in the city center was on quality in the urban space and creating better spaces for pedestrians and cyclists. The oil crisis also triggered the start of the transitions of Aalborg from being a city of industry to a city of knowledge and culture, as a consequence of the closing and moving of industries. This meant that the focus in the city center was on quality in the urban space and creating better spaces for pedestrians and cyclists. The bridge was expanded in 1960. It went from 2 lanes to 4 lanes, so from 8.5 meters to 12.5 meters wide. And the bike lane and the walking path was now placed on the outside of the original bridge. The official opening was the 9th of May 1960. The tunnel was decided by law in 1963. The decision to build the tunnel was based on traffic counts from 1962 that showed a yearly traffic of 8.9 million crossings, meaning a daily average of 24,000 cars. Projections for the future amount of cars predicted a daily average of 80,000 in 1980, corresponding to almost 3 times the amount of cars that the Limfjords Bridge was intended for. Indeed, new infrastructure to divert the traffic flows was needed to prevent Aalborg from further becoming a bottleneck of traffic. The construction of the tunnel began in 1964 and was completed in 1969. The bridge officially opened the 6th of May 1969, and the tunnel is a highway tunnel as part of the highway E45. The tunnel was the first of its kind in Denmark. The tunnel serves as both a relief for the local traffic, but also for the regional and national traffic.